Welcome to this seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce Silke. I don't even try to pronounce the last name because I will get it wrong.
It would be entertaining though.
Vanbeselaere.
Yes, that's almost
with a very
exactly
strong
nice.
Italian accent. She's a PhD student at Leuven.
Yes.
And is presenting today our log thy Theban neighbours.
Yes.
I'll leave it to you.
Okay. Yeah, I've been giving this kind of talk a couple of times now, and yeah, I'm going to change some things, and we'll see how it goes. So first of all, this is where Thebes is in ancient Egypt. It's a lovely ancient city with temples and really interesting things like the Valley of the Kings and the Queens, not to forget. But you know, sadly, we're not going to talk about any of that. We're going to talk about something a lot more interesting. We're going to talk about contracts and witnesses. Yay! I can see the enthusiasm on your faces. So what we have to start with is contracts. Contracts, they have three main actors. So they've got a scribe who draws up the document. It's got two contracting parties usually, and the main thing for me is that they usually have 16 witnesses, sometimes a bit less, but 16 seems to be the standard thing for early Ptolemaic contracts, Demotic contracts, so it's not in Greek, these ones. And nobody really knows that much about these witnesses or how they were chosen. They know that they lived in Thebes, but how they were connected to the scribes or to the contracting parties or who these people were, we don't really know. Researchers haven't really done that much with it because it's a bit difficult and because lots of witnesses only appear once or twice in a witness list, and you know, the only information we have about them is these kind of witness lists at the back of contracts just saying a name of somebody, son of another name, and that's basically it. But I was at a conference 2 years ago now, and this Dutch guy talked about witnesses in 18th century contracts, and he made me think that that sounds actually, you know, like a problem that we have, but in Ptolemaic Demotic contracts, and that seemed a lot more interesting than the research I was doing at the moment, so I changed my research and started doing this, although obviously it's not very exciting probably to other people. Anyway, I start all of my research from the grand database that is Trismegistos in Leuven. It's you know, the database of databases. We've got, I'm just going to boast a bit here about Trismegistos. We've got over, at the moment I think we've got over 500,000 of attestations of people actually, so more than is on there now. And we've got about 300,000 ancient texts in the database, and it expands all the way from 800 BC till AD 800. Lots of different ancient languages, so we don't only do Greek and Latin, but we do weird languages from Italy that I don't really know, but also Demotic and things from the Balkan as well. And we've started doing some other languages. Anyway, we're trying to, you know, get everything in there between those dates. And that is where I start from. So I'm really blessed that I don't have to go and source all the sources myself. I can just, you know, pile them together, all the ones that I'm interested in, and then start doing the research. Now, having said that, there's one problem for me there. Previous researchers at the Trismegistos database have been, and they are still, very interested in names and language things, but less so in the actual people. So we have a people database that is connected to the attestations of people in a text, and a text database and lots of other databases all connected together. But it's different from, for example, having your name appear in 20 different documents and having 20 files in a database for that, and then having one person file, because it's every time it's you who is just appearing in different documents. And in the Trismegistos database, it hasn't really happened for most of the sources that we have identified all those attestations of people to one person. So if you want to do network analysis, that's a bit, you know, a bit annoying. I'm going to try not to swear, but it's very annoying. because then I realized, oh, I can't just start playing around with these pretty graphs and make, interesting, quite artistic networks. So I had to start with identifying people. And I was trying to learn how to do this network visualization thing, the network statistics, and I thought, why not use that as a sort of test and try to identify people by using visualization as well. So I did that, and this is, this is what it looks like. Usually in the beginning, a couple of documents are connected, and you try and find identifications for people. So then I took it one step further. Instead of just, visualizing a thing and looking, oh, these are the same names, oh, and they have sort of the same connections, this could be the same person. I put in everything, all the data that we had for a particular period, for example, and then I narrowed it down. Instead of just having all these people, I appear in a text with you, for example, then we'll have that connection. And this is a really huge network of all these kind of connections, but if we are not identified in a network, then you'll appear 10 times and be connected to other people, but we won't know that it's each time you, and for me will be the same. So yeah, a huge network. But how do you start then if you've got such a huge network like that? It's not even, you can't even tell anything from it except that it's like a big blob, which is artistic slightly maybe, not sure actually. But how do you, how do you take it from there? So then I narrowed it down. Instead of looking at attestations of people, I narrowed it down to names, and the names that were most often connected to each other. I thought, well, if somebody called Silke appears 20 times with a person called Matteo, or a name Matteo, there might be something interesting there. Sometimes there's not. But that is the best point to start with, and so I went from this huge monster network to this slightly more manageable network of names, just names, so not people, that appear most frequently with one another. And then I started, doing research there, like, okay, which names appear most often with each other, and then like get more in detail and narrow it down a bit. So this is a sort of quite a crude visualization of how it works. So from the reference database, where you've got, so the colors represents one person, but they've got lots of different attestations, and they haven't been identified yet. So in the reference database, there are whatever 10 Matteos, for example, and 10 Silkes, but it's all actually just us. It's attestations, basically. And then through the traditional prosopography, you can narrow it down a little bit, but it takes a lot of time. And, that could be your whole life, probably, trying to narrow it down quite a bit. And I found actually with the data visualization and using some of the network tools, you could narrow it down a lot quicker, not having to be very clever. You don't have to be the best professor or anything like that, or have that much time on your hands to do it. So it's that was very useful for me. Now, this is a network. The one on the left is a network of scribes and contracting parties. Yes, scribes and contracting parties. On the left, it's the red nodes, so we call them nodes, the circles, are scribes, and they are connected to blue nodes if they have written a contract for them. So those are contracting parties. Now, that is what we call a two-mode network, so it's two different functions that people have, and they are connected, and people with the same functions aren't connected. But then you can narrow it down to, for example, if that scribe is Minis, has drawn up a contract for a blue node, so for a contracting party, and Totortaios, that scribe, has also done that, then in the next network, in the one-mode network, they will be connected because they've both done something for somebody that they have in common, even though they may not know each other or they may not have a connection. In the second network, they will be connected because they have had that person in common. So it doesn't always show you the reality, but it may tell you something, though, about most of the nodes, or, well, that's where the researching part comes in. It's not just like the computer is not going to tell you, oh, this is how it was in Ptolemaic Egypt. That's never going to happen. But But so this is how you go from a two-mode network to a one-mode network, where now you suddenly have on the right-hand side a network of scribes, and they are connected when they had contracting parties in common. I have to admit, when I started this was my very first experiment that I did. I didn't really know anything about scribes in Thebes. I just started and I did this in one day, what I'm going to tell you now. So I was quite excited with all this. I managed to do it, give it nice colors, so, you know, I felt quite chuffed about myself. That happens a lot. Now, I thought, because there's the general opinion about scribes is that if your father is a scribe, you will probably become a scribe as well. And that's quite, you know, a standard opinion, and I wouldn't contest that. So I thought, if these scribes are connected to each other, that means that they have had the same contracting parties, they worked for the same contracting parties. So that may actually mean that they worked together in the notary, they were family or something like that, they were colleagues. And as you can see, that guy in the middle, 8343, he's called Esminis, he seemed to, you know, be like the center of this kind of scribal. This is all just me in my head thinking, what could this mean? He seems to be like this central scribe. And I thought, oh, if I now add family links between those nodes, then they will overlap these ones, and then I will have proved my point that I understand what I'm actually doing here. So then I did that, and you can't maybe immediately tell, but the only thing that happened was there was no overlap whatsoever. There were just tiny nodes that were added to it. And I thought, okay, that's a bit annoying. But either that means that the main theory of all the researchers before me is wrong, and that there were no family relations in scribal notaries in Thebes, which is probably not, you know, they were probably right. So I don't think that's probably not the reason. I probably made a mistake, that's more likely. And the mistake was that I didn't realize by then that the Trismegistus database hadn't identified all those people. So, because we didn't have that identification there, we just added nodes to this network and it didn't overlap. Now, I wanted to test that because that was just an idea. And so this is the same network as this one, but here I've added all the nodes of the fathers as separate nodes, and then I've colored them. For example, that main node that we saw here, the 8343, is called Esminis, and I thought, okay, if I add all the fathers' nodes of the scribes that were surrounded by him, and I check what name they actually had, maybe there will be this kind of overlap, which will make sense again in the general theory. And indeed that happens. Some of those fathers' names of the nodes surrounding Esminis were also Esminis, probably meaning that we just had to identify those nodes still in our database, and then it would overlap, as I thought it would at first. So this was later in the day. I then decided, okay, those nodes that have a father's name that is Esminis, I'll just for me, think that they are the sons of Esminis and color them. So the red nodes here are family of Esminis. That makes a bit more sense already. This is just, you know, it wasn't proven or anything. I did quite a lot more research, and I found out that there were probably quite a lot of those connections, but I didn't have like hard proof for it or anything. And I was feeling quite chuffed with myself by the evening. Because I drew up this kind of family tree. And then I remember that very well. I think it was my first month in London or so. And so I had this amazing day of discoveries that I thought. And I drew this up. And then in the evening, I was reading an article, as academics do. We don't really have a life, so, you know. I was reading an article. And I discovered that the great Pastman, I think, that he had already done a whole study about these scribes, and he had written a lovely article. You know, it was really well written and probably not presented at all the way that I would. And I don't have an example of that. And yeah, he had sort of already proven everything that I had just spent the whole day on working on. So I felt very sad and disappointed. But then I suddenly realized, okay, I have just started doing research on these Theban scribes. I've just done it for a day now. I don't even know that much about this subject at all. That's how I work sometimes, not always. And I managed to actually draw up a family tree almost exactly as the great Paswan, he's really a big name, had done. And I don't know how long he worked on it, I can't ask him, but I bet it was more than a day. So actually this, I think, showed to me that I could actually do things with this, and not only in the traditional way of that people in statistics have done and used network analysis, but if you think a little bit more creatively, or if you're just a bit lazy like I am, then you can actually use it for different things that are useful for us. The other things are also useful, but it opens up a lot more things, and it's not some kind of complicated statistics that you have to do, because it's usually mostly the visualization part that is so helpful, and the way that you can link people that are not just like only one hop away because they appear in the same document or something, or they have a direct family relationship, but sometimes people that are even maybe 3 hops away. So say you're family of this person and he is a contracting party with somebody else in a contract, so they have this kind of business arrangement, and then there's something else, and you can still see all of that in your visualization technique, and sometimes that may point to something, other times it doesn't, but yeah, so I think it's quite exciting to try and use this visualization for us to just speed up our research. You still have to check it with other things. Now, what I wanted to do, but I first had to do all the identifications, was look at who these witnesses were in the contracts. Whether they were attached to the scribal offices, as some people have suggested, so they were sort of professional witnesses, or whether they were chosen by the contracting parties. That seems more like, for me, you know, living in the time that we do, that seems like a more normal thing. Or maybe one of the professors in Leuven, really Clarisse, thinks that they were just randomly picked from the streets. And he's a very, you know, very respected professor, and I love him dearly. But I don't think that works, because 16 people have to be picked from the streets. That is manageable. But then what happens if there's disputes about the contracts? You have to be able to find those people again, because that's why they had 16 witnesses, because it was still so important, that whole oral kind of contract. And you had to find those people again to then say, okay, you have all witnessed that this is how we agreed to it. So I think picking 16 people from Thebes, even though it may not have been that big, still it would be a bit annoying then having to go and find all these people again if there's not already some kind of relationship. So I don't really believe what he's saying, but we're still having this lovely dispute about it. Now, first of all, how does it start? You can always stop me if I'm going on too long. This is basically how it starts. It's not a very attractive network. There's no colors. It's a bit, yeah, it's just a big blob. So this is a network of all the actors in Theban contracts, and it's a big mess. And it doesn't tell you anything really. Now, if you narrow it down to scribes, contracting parties, and witnesses, which is what people have been studying for quite some time now, not very much the witnesses, but still those 3 are regarded as the main 3 components in a contract. Then yeah, you can probably say something about these contracts. I have tried, definitely. I haven't explained what density is, but it is over all the links that you could have in a network, how many are there actually and how many are used. So this here is, it's not a real bad number for density, but I thought in those contracts, for people who don't know these contracts, so it's between 2 contracting parties, there's a scribe and there's usually 16 witnesses, but most of those contracts are about land, houses, and they will almost always mention the neighbour that lives on the northern land of it, the southern land, west, east. And lots of people, well, a couple of obscure ancient historians have used it to make these kind of fancy maps of Thebes. but they haven't really done anything else with it. And I think definitely, well, I come from a village as well. Anyway, in an ancient society, and it's not super big, you will sort of know your neighbours, even if it's in a hate relationship, but there is a kind of relationship that is more than just a physical, geographical reality there. And I thought it would be interesting, and I thought it was a shame that we didn't include neighbours there, because they could be a link as well. And I don't think anybody took me very seriously, but then I don't have slides on that. I did a study, I did some research into what other ancient Near Eastern contracts people did. And in some places, like in Babylon, they definitely used neighbours or contacts of the neighbours as witnesses, because it's important for those neighbours as well to know what's, not really to know what's going on, but they are sort of a part of that land, if you see what I mean. It's connected to them, and so they were used as witnesses. There were also other people used as witnesses, but I thought that was a very interesting concept, that those neighbours had a kind of part in it, or family of the neighbours. So they were definitely involved, and that is basically how I started doing some of this research and involving the neighbours again, definitely because we have that information, and it's not meaningless that it's there. It's a very straightforward geographical thing as well, but it's more than that, I think. It's a social relationship there as well. Now, if we look at the network of scribes parties and contracting parties and neighbours, and we leave out the witnesses to see how that network works, and we look at the people that have the highest betweenness value, that means that somebody is important in connecting different groups. So a group may have lots of connections inside itself. For example, if you've got 5 friends and they all know each other and they all share information with each other, and then you've got another group of 5 friends and they all know each other and they all share information with each other, then you've got one person who maybe only knows one person of the one group and one of the other group. Some people may think, oh, he's not very popular or she's not very popular, but she actually has that position in the network where she can choose whether information is going from one group to the other group, so that is quite important. And we can see here that the neighbours score very highly in that regard, actually. So they are sort of connecting in a physical way, but I think also in a different way, between these contracting parties and scribes. So I thought that we shouldn't ignore that and look a bit more into that. Yeah, so then I narrowed it down to look at the most important ones. And yeah, I'm still doing some more of that. Now, this is just now a whole load of examples, but only focused on contracting parties, because I can't show you all my networks, because that's my entire thesis. Here on the left, so these are 2 of the same networks. They're exactly the same, except that the colors are different. On the left, they just show you who is the first party and the second party. So how the transfer of property is going. And on the right-hand side, the colors represent archives. So some of these contracts and other things, letters and stuff, were put together in an archive. And that may tell us something that gives us extra information on where things belong to and how they're connected in social reality. That's interesting for later. So these networks are just contracting parties who have been together in a contract, and so property has gone from one party to the other. That is the directionality that you can see there as well. Now, these are all the same people, and this is basically the same network, except that now the connections are based, so the nodes are the same, the people are the same, but the connections are based on the scribes that they have used in common. So if I have used a scribe to draw up a contract and Matteo has used the same scribe, we will have a connection in this network now. And as you can see, there's just quite a lot of overlap in archives there, and probably a couple of scribes who are quite popular, and it doesn't really tell me all that much immediately, I think. But then when we look at this one, for example, this is again a network of the same contracting scribes, but according to the witnesses that they had in common. And obviously I left out, when you've got two contracting parties in the same contracts, I left out all the connections that they have with each other, because that is, you know, that is just obvious. But when they had witnesses that they used apart from each other in different contracts, when they weren't together mentioned in a contract, they get a connection here. And here you can see that it's very much a lot more than with the scribes. It seems to more be grouped according to the archives that they belong to. So there's definitely, that means that there's definitely some kind of connection between the witnesses, or the choice of witnesses, or their connection with these archives. And archives are mainly something that belong to the contracting parties, because it's something in a family that is, I have a couple of contracts and then I will give it on to my daughter or son, and it goes like that. So it's about family and the contracting parties, and there's a lot more here that you can see of like a grouping that is going on. And I think that points towards maybe an interpretation of that. Quite a lot of the witnesses were probably chosen by contracting parties. That is still something that I believe. And then there's, here we come with the neighbours. This is the same nodes, so the same people again, but here they are connected depending on neighbours that they have in common. So this is not a map of Thebes, or of that district of Thebes, but it is a sort of abstract map almost, because all these people are quite closely connected. So even though sometimes we don't really know how it works, because we've got a northern neighbour, southern neighbour, and it's quite difficult if you have to like spread it out all over the floor and try to have an actual geographical map. But this, with these connections, we can just see, oh, these people were, you know, living next to each other. It doesn't really matter where it was. So yeah, they're fairly closely connected. And these then, this network is a sum of all those previous connections that we saw. And lots of people in social network analysis immediately go for this one. They just put in all the connections that they have between people. But then I find it very difficult to see what the different things are, and I think it's very useful to look at the big components in the end, but also to look at all the different components and try to think it really through what it means each time. And it's quite difficult because it doesn't always, there's not usually not one answer or anything like that. But I think it's useful to look at all these different networks and then bring them together and see what it tells you about these people. It's very much a work in progress that I'm still doing. But then another thing that you can do, we're almost there. This is a little bit, well, it's not really complicated. It makes sense. It's basically people or nodes that have the same kind of connections with people, or the same amounts, but also the same sort of connections with people, are probably interesting to put in a list. For example, if I've got 30 people I know academically and I do things with them socially, and Matteo does too, and we put all those kind of people in a list, maybe there's something that we have in common about us. It may not be the same people that we have in common, but there's something, an aspect of us that we have in common. And it's a lot easier to do that with something very straightforward as a contract than doing it with a friendship network or something, because there's so many more motives that can be behind that. But if you do it for contracts, there's a kind of limited things that it could mean. So I think that's one of the interesting things to do next as well with that. Yeah, that's it. I hope that was kind of clear. It's quite, yeah, kind of a lot to go. But if it wasn't clear, just check out our blog, and it's a lot easier because it's about Harry Potter, basically, Harry Potter networks. So, well, that's probably only for a certain generation. If you've got any questions, please go ahead, because I understand that this can be quite, if you're not really into it. But thank you for your attention.